Good afternoon. Welcome to the second session, this afternoon's first day of our conference, the second session. We had a very stimulating roundtable from theory to praxis, Black Studies Beyond the Academy. And now we have a panel, Beyond Boundaries, Intellectual Legacies of IRAAS Scholarship. It's a session that's going to highlight scholarship by IRAAS alums whose work engages various fields and subfields within Black, African American, African diaspora studies. I hear something, okay. Panelists will connect their work to new paradigms and innovations for the future of Black studies. It will also highlight the legacy and influence of IRAAS on their current work and their placement in the academy. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak, which will be alphabetical order, and give you their titles, and then we'll just go from there. And each panelist has the option of either presenting from here, or some of you might have PowerPoint. You're welcome to present from the podium as well. So, Marr Bruce received his BA from Columbia University and his PhD from Yale. He is an interdisciplinary humanities scholar, cultural and literary critic, Black Studies devotee, self-proclaimed, and assistant professor of American Studies at the University of Maryland. He is the recipient of the 2014 Joseph Wexelman Prize from African American Review, the 2016 Postdoctoral Fellowship from the Ford Foundation, and the 2018 Sterling Leadership from Vanderbilt University. He studies Black expressive cultures, queer theory, protest art, disability studies, and theories of madness and joy. His first book, How to Go Mad Without Losing Your Mind, Madness and Black Radical Creativity, is forthcoming from Duke University Press. So please join me in welcoming Professor Bruce. We're going to be Zinga Fraser, who you met at the last panel and who I briefly introduced. I'll introduce a little more thoroughly now, if I can find her bio in here, because she didn't give it to me. Okay. Zinga Fraser, as I told you, is assistant professor in the Africana Studies Department and Women and Gender Studies program at Brooklyn College, as well as a visiting professor here at the Institute for Research in African American Studies. And she is also the director of the Shirley Chisholm Project on Brooklyn women's activism at Brooklyn College, currently creating her book manuscript entitled Sister Insider, Sister Outsider, Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, Black Women's Politics in the Post-Civil Rights Era. Zinga holds her doctorate in African American Studies from Northwestern University and her master's from the Institute for Research in African American Studies. She's the recipient of numerous awards, including the AUW Fellowship and the American Political Science Association Award in Minority and Urban Politics. Her work has been published widely in a number of journals, including Souls, and also Phyllis, a journal of African American women's history, and other publications. Zinga has served as a legislative assistant on Capitol Hill, and she serves as co-chair of the IRAAS Alumni Council, and it was in that capacity that she helped to organize today's two panels. So thank you, Zinga. And Zinga's title for her paper is Black Congressional Women's Freedom Dreams, Redefining American Democracy. Thank you, Zinga. And our next panelist is Professor Russell Rickford, who's an associate professor of history at Cornell University, where he specializes in African American political culture after World War II, the Black radical tradition, and transnational movements. His current book, We Are an African People, Independent Education, Black Power, and the Radical Imagination, received the Liberty Legacy Award from the Organization of American Historians. He's currently working on a book about Guyana and African American radical politics in the 1970s. His scholarly articles have appeared in the Journal of American History, the Journal of African American History, Souls, New Labor Review, and other publications. He also writes for publications such as In These Times, The Washington Post, and Counterpunch. And some of you may be familiar with an earlier book, a biography of Dr. Betty Shabazz. Today's title is The Guerrilla Intellectual, Walter Rodney as Praxis. So thank you. And last but in no way least is Natalie Shilbey, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the program on Race, Science, and Society at the University of Pennsylvania. She is currently working on a manuscript about African Americans and homosexuality investigations in the U.S. military between the 1940s and 1990s. She won the Du Bois Wells Prize from the African American Intellectual History Society for research from that project. Natalie earned her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, where she is the first recipient of a joint doctoral degree in Africana Studies and History, and we claim her because she received her BA from Columbia. So welcome, Natalie. All right, each panelist will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thinking about today's conference and planning my remarks to talk about new directions in the field of African American African diaspora studies, as someone whose academic career has been solidly within AFAM departments, despite suggestions that being in this field would be somewhat risky, refuting the history that Black studies would eventually die out, in part my discussion and commitment to Black studies reflects both a political and intellectual belief in the discipline. It is the very fact of working within a field that continues to be on the cusp of methodological and theoretical innovations. As Professor Eddie Glaude affirms, it is the very fact that Black studies pushes the boundaries of knowledge production that solidifies its purpose. When I began my project at IRAAS, the privilege was the fact that we were encouraged, even armed, to think and work through and work across disciplines. It was not seen as risky or less rigorous. Indeed, it was more nuanced and challenging. My project on Black women's politics points to new interventions that exist in Black women's history, Black power studies, feminist studies, and Black politics. While my intellectual work in part explores the political life of Shirley Chisholm, here I was able to see how a center or institute engaged in active research projects. It provided new possibilities, as Dr. Griffin in her office hours asked me the profound question in deciding a career in the academy. She asked, "What do you want your day to consist of?" I responded with research, teaching, writing, and engagement with the public. I'm not sure if this was a great week to answer that question because I'm juggling a number of different things, another keynote later on Friday. But however, I always come back to that question. As the director of the Shirley Chisholm Project, I'm doing both intellectual and public work, and this work began here. Here at IRAAS, I was able to confront what the memory of Chisholm might be, and I couldn't even have imagined that today in 2019 that part of that work would be ensuring that Chisholm's legacy is intact. So in keeping with the conference theme, I thought about how Black studies continues to speak about freedom and how Black women especially are engaged in fighting for collective freedom. Dr. Robin Kelley proposes an important question in the preface of Freedom Dreams. He writes, quote, "How do we produce a vision that enables us to see beyond our immediate ordeals? How do we transcend bitterness and embrace love, hope, and an all-encompassing dream of freedom, especially in these rough times?" For Black people within the African diaspora, their existence has and continues to occur during rough times. One of those rough times was November the 8th, 2016, the day after the 2016 election. I was part of a roundtable for New York Women's Politics, a C-SPAN book taping, and I suspect that the program's organizers believed that this would be a celebratory and historic moment. The panel consisted of myself, as well as the daughters of former Congresswoman Bella Abzug and the vice presidential nominee Geraldine Ferraro. Indeed, it was a historic moment of which was all too familiar for me. While the majority of the audience expressed shock and dismay, I was in shock or surprised. A young woman in the audience in tears asked me why sexism was so pervasive such that it allowed Hillary Clinton to lose. Being the only Black woman on the panel, I said internally, maybe this conversation should be had amongst the majority of white women in the audience, but I responded in a different way, that while patriarchy was central to the maintaining of political power, it was also tantamount to the maintenance of white supremacy, and the historical record continues to show us that when given a choice like Chisholm and others, a portion of white women in particular continue to choose white men despite their dream of a woman president, as it was in 1972 when Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm runs. Many of white feminists at the convention were not devoid of anti-racism, or as they referred to as pragmatism. Yet for them, freedom did not exist within the body of a Black woman. So my discussion today will highlight the freedom dreams of two congressional women, Barbara Jordan and Shirley Chisholm, but most importantly, I will explore their redefinition and their reimagining of American democracy. No other women fascinates me more than Jordan and Chisholm, who speak to the simultaneous struggles against white supremacy, patriarchy, and anti-Blackness. What is more profound and possibly more important is how they sought to imagine and craft a full life that combated everyday attacks on their humanity. Their dream in revising America within a legislature is not solely confined to bills and amendments, but they also exist in liminal spaces. Their refusal to be invisible by not only taking up space, but redefining it. To strategically use the House floor, podiums, committee rooms, folding chairs, congressional steps, and dining halls to confront the institution and its members on sexism, racism, and misogyny. During the first months of being in Congress, Shirley Chisholm would walk past a white Southern representative, and then under his breath, he would always say, 42-5, 42-5. And after a while, Chisholm gets fed up, and she confronts him and says, why are you always with this 42-5? And he would respond, I can't believe you make 42-5 just like me. And so Chisholm, in her response, would say, the next time you see me walk on the House floor, vanish, disappear, because I'm paving the way for more women like me to make 42-5. So Black congressional women's dreams went beyond being elected to political office. Theirs was a dream of possibilities that sought political power to unravel systems and institutions. The first cadre of Black congressional women emerged at a time of political unrest and upheaval due to the Vietnam War, political assassinations, and Black rebellions in the streets. These women, along with a host of Black elected officials in the 1960s, were beneficiaries of a prolonged struggle that secured voting rights and election rights for Black communities. While the popular depictions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 served as a watershed moment in the civil rights movement that resulted in the election of Blacks to office, a longer and more complicated movement exists, as well as a Black freedom struggle for those who sought political office. The late 1960s served as a new political frontier that attracted a divergent group of intellectuals, activists, elected officials who attempted to reimagine new visions for political power. Unlike their political foremothers who operated behind the scenes, Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan, they did not abide by that kind of rationale. Scholar Laverne McCain-Gill argues that because Black women have had to overcome invisibility in a country that traditionally viewed African American progress as male and feminist progress as white. Despite Black congressional women's engagement in the Black feminist politics, and I make a larger theoretical discussion about what Black feminist politics looks like for them, they are all but erased from the histories of the second wave feminists and African American politics. In many ways, even current scholars today look at these women and don't engage them with rigor. In spite of the unimaginable, when Black women run for congressional office in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and when the aspiration for public office were usually met with questions about their sanity. So I like your discussion about madness. In part, the decision to aspire to run for majority newly formed Black political seats was entangled with the belief that they were seats reserved solely for Black male leadership. For Shirley Chisholm, the daughter of working-class Caribbean immigrants who by 1966 was in this New York State Assembly, the dream of public service should have been limited to local or state office. Chisholm recalls the defining moment for her decision to run for Congress. She writes, "I was undecided about running, but a Black welfare mother came to my house and told me that she and her friends wanted me to run. She gave me an envelope containing $9.62 in nickels, dimes, and quarters that they had raised and promised that if I ran, that they would sponsor fundraising affairs every Friday night to help finance my campaign. This was my first campaign contribution. It was the kind of help that contributed to my upset victory in the primary, and their gesture moved me to tears." And so Chisholm, throughout her time in Congress, continues to talk about the people who had little money, how they felt invested in her campaign. The power of this quote and that campaign was the ability to energize and open up electoral politics to citizenry that was locked out. Campaigning in Bedford-Stuyvesant housing projects, and her decision to center her campaign from the eyes of a welfare woman reflected Chisholm's disdain for respectability politics and her continuing policy agenda that passed legislation on food assistance, domestic violence, domestic workers, and maternity leave. Unlike her male opponent, who would be civil rights leader James Farmer, oh Lord, no, this is not in the right order, but okay. Who was a former member of CORE, his decisions to run for the first Black congressional seat in Brooklyn affirmed that it was both his birthright and possibly the privilege by Brooklynites due to his national status. While many questioned the political acuteness of Black women, they immediately saw past Farmer's glitz and glam that reflected a Harlem politics, not Brooklyn, also of which where Farmer was not a resident of. These Black women aligned themselves to Chisholm's unbought and unbossed ideology. And so this picture is really also a depiction of Shirley Chisholm. She's an educator. She runs a daycare center in Brooklyn. And so they always framed her as this school teacher, the school marm. And this is another picture of James Farmer's, actually his campaign material that always says, "In case you've forgotten, Jim Farmer was always in front." And so his discussion or this flyer literally points to his decision to say that it's because of the work that I do that I need to go to Brooklyn to represent you. Not because I know anything about Brooklyn, not because I care anything about Brooklyn, but I should maintain this sense of power because of who I am and what I've done in the past. So Barbara Jordan, on the other hand, is a daughter of the South. Her entrance into Texas politics would also be out of reach for a young Black lawyer who's from Houston's Fifth Ward. Being the first African American to be elected to Congress from Texas since Reconstruction was unimaginable. For the Texas Southern graduate who led her debate team to wins over Brown and Yale University and a draw with Harvard, she was all too familiar with overcoming insurmountable odds. Politically, Texas was a far more difficult political terrain than Brooklyn. In Texas, the legislative battles of all white primaries were standard and effective in disenfranchising Black voters in Texas. Texas was the center of cowboy politics, where white legislators maintained Jim Crow legislation unapologetically. In 1960, former US President LBJ, who was serving as a Texas U.S. Senator, his response to the likelihood of a Black student rebellion occurring in Texas was, quote, "Texas Negroes are far too complacent to engage in public protests," end quote. Jordan's run rejected that statement, that they were somehow servile and complacent. Unlike Chisholm, Jordan would have 2 failed elections for the state Senate, and until she was able to win on her 3rd try. However, a dream of public visibility and being the first Black representative in Texas since 1883, she would have to confront what may appear as a dream as also resembling a nightmare. She was described by a Texas colleague as a nigger mammy washerwoman. And on many occasions, they referenced and put pictures of Jordan in reference to Aunt Jemima. One columnist recalls she wasn't just Black and female, she was homely, she was heavy, she was dark Black. When she first came to the Texas Senate, it was considered a joke to bring a racist friend to the gallery. When she was due to speak, they would no longer soon grasp, "Who is that nigger?" Then she would open her mouth and out would roll language Lincoln would have appreciated, end quote. Many within the legislature would recall that hearing Jordan speak was like listening to God. She would learn that later her congressional career, that her self-awareness and the embodiment of a Black woman would provide benefits for making claims around morality and integrity during the Watergate situation. While Jordan rejected the framing of victimhood, she was able to strategically become one of the nation's most effective political powerhouses in Texas, as well as the nation. And so going to Texas, and if you've ever been to the Austin, Texas airport, there is a full body. When I say full body, I mean full, has to be at least 7 to 8 feet tall, full bust, bronze body of Barbara Jordan. And I was amazed the first time I saw it. That did not occur in terms of Shirley Chisholm. So Chisholm and Jordan are part of a rich tradition of Black Americans who serve as the nation's most eloquent, insightful, and long-standing proponents of American democracy. While their efforts to ensure that they and marginalized communities would be fully able to utilize their citizenship rights as it pertains to racial, political, and economic equality. Their efforts to challenge, confront, and reimagine democracy does not provide a triumphant ending, but speaks to a tenuous and fragile construction that it may never live up to its ideals, such that from its inception, it view Black people as a problem. In terms of redefining American democracy, these women's roles go beyond the symbolism, but their efforts both legislatively and politically to change American politics. No greater example of politically reimagining American democracy than Shirley Chisholm asserting her citizenship right to be the first African American and the first woman to run for the presidency in 1972. And this is her response and why she ran. Chisholm refused any framing that did not proclaim that her right for a full, did not proclaim that she had the right to run as a full citizen. Chisholm's presidential bid was framed by pundits, strategists, scholars, political leadership as an unrealistic goal, and in many ways they called her, I don't want to curse, but they said that she was batshit crazy. Right? So some of her vehement critics against her run suggested that she was a divisive figure within the CBC, as well as an inept politician and policymaker. For Black male leadership, especially her colleagues in the CBC, saw her decision to assert her right as a full attack on them, proclaiming that her ability to receive delegates at the Democratic Convention could derail and destroy the Black delegation's efforts to have leverage with the political nominee. Her coalition with feminists and women being one of the largest and the newest delegation in 1972, many within the party saw the potential of Chisholm damaging the balance of power. In response to how she viewed her candidacy, she writes, "The helpless and the powerless who are left out of the scheme of things in this country, if they understand the nature of power in this country, will come together and make the system deal with us. Because you cannot deal with it alone. No Black person can elect a president alone in this country. Women cannot elect a president alone. Chicanos and Puerto Ricans and Indian cannot elect a president alone. But these are all the people who have been left out. But these people are those people whose advice and consent I seek. And their consent has never been sought in terms of a presidential ticket. But together we can put that ticket without being left out," end quote. Chisholm's decision to create a coalition of young people, women, minorities, sparks the dream of Barack Obama, who wins with the same coalition of voters. Despite the framing of scholars to discount Chisholm's run on the basis of not winning the nomination or her lack of money, and attempts to erase the sheer success of Chisholm receiving over 400,000 votes in 14 Democratic primaries and a total of 152 delegates at the convention. So and I think I didn't even show the picture. And so this is Chisholm at the convention. So another, and my last kind of revision of democracy, really talks about Barbara Jordan and the Watergate Trial. Jordan's role in the Judiciary Committee and speech in 1974, she forces people to not only confront issues around presidential powers, but also identifies with who claims to interpret the Constitution. Jordan's testimony in the Watergate impeachment provided a class on the Constitution to Americans and possibly the world. Understanding how being an African-American woman would be read as incongruous, Jordan opens with what W.E.B. Du Bois identifies as the African-American dilemma in the conversation of races, where he asks, what after all am I? Am I an American or am I a Negro? Can I be both? Jordan writes. So she writes, and this is on the screen, "We the people, it is very eloquent beginning, but when the document was completed on the 17th of September in 1787, I was not included in that. We the people, I felt somehow for many years that George Washington and Alexander Hamilton just left me out by mistake. But through the process of amendment, interpretation, and court decision, I have finally been included in we the people." Jordan inserts an identity politic that does not place her outside of its protection, but helps inform her faith and devotion, as well as a revision of the Constitution. Jordan addresses the contradictions with situating herself as an authority and protector of a Constitution that excluded her from full citizenship. Although her speech articulates a redemptive quality within the American creed, she also critiques America's hypocrisy. Scholar Barbara Holmes explains that Jordan's Watergate speech teaches constitutional lessons and puts Nixon's deed on the rhetorical witness stand. She allows the criteria for impeachment to cross-examine as if a case against him is being tried. Aware of her audience, Jordan spoke directly to a confused and uninformed public, and the numerous dissenting letters that Jordan received from the public, many of which discuss how much they hated her, they also expressed gratitude for her methodical approach to both educate and inform them about the impeachment process. And so Jordan's revision was her declaration that the problems of Watergate are not confined solely to Nixon, but reflect a larger problem of immorality within the U.S. democratic institution. Jordan was eerily pointing to the disease of neoliberalism and fascism that currently pervades our government and democracy. Both Jordan and Chisholm's critique of Nixon, Reagan, and Bush provide insights on their efforts while in office, or out. They view the momentum of neoliberalism's role in dismantling social welfare. Both women proposed legislation, whether it be around welfare or expanding Social Security benefits for the most marginalized communities. They sought to expand LBJ's Great Society, believing that it was essential to create social safety nets for poor and working class people. When critics state that both women were merely symbols and the institutions of government restricted their efforts to make real changes, they provide a better example that one thinks about when we think about the larger legacy, the symbolic legacy of, I would say, President Barack Obama, former president, that speaks to the substantive policy gains in securing social policies that protected marginalized communities. These women push us to be better students on rejecting racialized and gender tropes of the welfare queen and corner boys. Despite their location to power and their own class status, they did not adapt a narrative that sees the impoverished conditions of poor and working class people and blames them for their condition, rather than the structures that they exist in. The question is, what can be gleaned from their freedom dreams? And what relevance may it have been for this very moment? I hope that their political lives continue to provide an entry point to at least understand the contested spaces that exist for Black women in electoral office, the constant effort to confront the state while working within that apparatus. Their dream, as well as an attacks on their bodies, careers, and constituents, allows us to recognize contemporary attacks on Congresswoman Maxine Waters, for example, and the new Representative Ilhan Omar. It also points to the importance of a look back at women, Black women, as a political constituency that is a force to be reckoned with. I'm a bit pessimistic that the Democratic Party missed an opportunity, specifically after the election that was really off of the backs of African American and minority women for the House to go to the Democratic Party. They decide not to support one of the most progressive members of Congress, and that would be Barbara Lee. And so when Barbara Lee runs for the House leadership position, she is denied. She's denied not only because she's a woman, but she's also denied because she's an older woman. And so the question is, will the Democratic Party align itself with the most reliable, radical, and progressive constituency in which they have, and that would be Black women. So I'll just end it there.
I am grateful to the organizers of this conference, deeply grateful, and I'm incredibly humbled to be on such a distinguished panel. I'm also mad, though, because I just assumed on the way down here that we were all going drinking later. And I see all of these beloved people, that some of whom I haven't seen for years, and it turns out that everybody's got things to do, so I guess we're grown. But I'm very moved to be back in the bosom of IRAAS. So this, of course, is a particularly auspicious moment for reflection. Not only has IRAAS, of course, reached a milestone, but in fact, an entire generation of Black studies are marking their 50th anniversary. And at the same time, we are grappling with the astounding reality that African people's sojourn in North America has entered its 400th year. So this is indeed a time for reflection and rededication. IRAAS memories. It was within the halls of IRAAS that my most robust and enduring conceptions of Black studies took shape. Members of my cohort and I used to joke that if the books that we would someday write were not being bootlegged on 125th Street, then we would know then that we were no longer relevant. In all seriousness, 125th was a formidable presence throughout our tenure as graduate students. Technically, it lay 6 floors below the offices of IRAAS, but symbolically, it loomed above us, always confronting us, daring us to produce, with all of the benefits of the Ivy League, resources at our disposal, some work of culture, of art, of analysis that was worthy of proximity to such an august thoroughfare. It was an intimidating challenge in many respects, and it still is. Yet many of us had arrived at IRAAS already devoted to education for liberation, and we doggedly pursued that tantalizing ideal, and we do today. So some of us formed a radical study group. You heard Megan in the last panel talk about Black Historians Matter. We also had a radical study group of 2, occasionally communing with a small coterie of Black Marxists down at NYU. We aspired to become what we called guerrilla intellectuals, even as we struggled to determine precisely what that evocative phrase meant. And though we rarely discussed it, we recognized that we were matriculating at an elite private institution with a very particular history, with a patently colonial relationship to its Black neighbors, and that we were thus being groomed, at best, to speak on behalf of 125th Street, and at worst, to inhabit a comprador class that would reap marginal rewards through its complicity in the oppression of 125th Street. In other words, we were compromised, and we are compromised still. We felt a deep allegiance to the people of 125th Street. In many ways, their lives and struggles were the objects of our study, but we recognized that in the bourgeois logic of academic professionalization, success meant leaving them behind. In a sense, our crisis of legitimacy was entirely appropriate. Such a crisis has always haunted Black studies. Indeed, the original Black studies rebellions were outward manifestations of the internal crisis felt by so many students of color on campus, whether the institutions they attended were predominantly white or historically Black. Their sense of alienation, their quest for social relevance spawned insurgencies that transformed higher education and helped revolutionize Black consciousness. Black studies arose after almost a decade of struggle, social struggle, political struggle, a decade initiated in 1960 with new waves of youth militancy. So Black studies emerged just as that movement, that Black freedom movement, had reached a crossroads, and it emerged in many respects because the movement had reached a crossroads, that Black people had reached the limitations of earlier phases of revolt, and they were groping and groping for new philosophical directions and new logics of struggle. Black studies was part of that groping. Black studies is part of that groping, that experimentation and that contestation. It was an attempt to develop new epistemologies based on the principles of self-definition and self-determination of people of African descent. You know, today critics critics on the left, critics on the right, continue to dismiss black studies as a shallow expression of what they call today identity politics. But black power and black studies were never merely about self-affirmation or self-esteem. They were about decolonization. The decolonization of knowledge and consciousness, but also the material liberation of the masses of African people wherever they were to be found. Black studies, we must recall, appeared in a very particular socio-historical context in the wake of the urban insurrections of the 1960s. A movement in its own right, black studies drew energy from the grassroots mobilizations of the black poor and working class. It leveraged the ongoing threat of their rebellion in order to institutionalize itself. It did so consciously and soberly, promising that as a discipline and a movement, it would remain anchored within the social, cultural, and political life of its primary constituency, the black community. Part of the rationale for black studies was that it would provide a mechanism as a discipline and as a movement by which to transfer to the underdeveloped and abandoned black communities that surround so many campuses some of the incredible wealth and resources of the modern university. This, of course, was a utopian goal. Not in the sense that it was fantastical, though perhaps it was. It was utopian because for institutions of higher learning to play such a role, to supplement the infrastructure and political economy of grassroots black communities, those institutions would have to be dramatically reorganized and reimagined. They would have to be remade even as black scholars struggled to remake themselves. Of course, the more black studies became imbricated with the internal apparatuses of the corporate university, the further it drifted from a utopian political imaginary and from any thoroughgoing sense of social mission. In time, it became possible to erect within the bosom of the ivory tower a formidable ebony tower. Within this cloister, black studies intellectuals could produce knowledge in great comfort, but also in almost complete isolation from the daily struggles of the black rank and file. The social mission of black studies, nevertheless, survives. Some scholars resisted institutional and social inertia. They strove to produce knowledge alongside the working people whose energy had propelled them into the academy in the first place and whose labor continued to sustain them while they were there. One of the greatest representatives of this strain of activist intellectuals was the Guyanese historian, Marxist, and Pan-Africanist Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney talked about groundings with my sisters and brothers. I invoked Walter Rodney the other day, and I said the same thing, and Carol Boyce Davies corrected me, and she said, no, he said groundings with my brothers. Of course, that's true, but we deign to adapt. Rodney was audacious enough to believe that the production of knowledge, that building knowledge, had to be done alongside working people. That indeed, as a historian, as a scholar, his role was to articulate the past and the present in such a way that captured the aspirations of working people and that helped them in some small measure to forge a more just future for themselves, to better forge a more just future for themselves. Rodney embodied the principle that those of us who, by grace and luck, have the time and the opportunity to produce knowledge in a specialized, formalized sense, have a special responsibility to labor to transcend the elite conventions of Western intellectualism and epistemology and place whatever talents we may have at the feet of our people. So, can the tension between Black studies as a field and as a movement ever truly be resolved? Well, who knows? But that tension at times has produced a creative friction, a dialectic that seizes us, compels us to return to the paths of struggle. At best, Black studies remains an unfinished revolution. It is a domesticated enterprise in some respects, deeply embedded within the neoliberal university, ensconced in its logics of professionalization, bound to reward structures that encourage careerism, individualism, political quiescence, and the privatization of knowledge. Still, the subversive elements of Black studies endure the Rodneyan tradition that refuses to accommodate wealth and power, that resists co-optation, that rejects liberalism and its anemic rhetoric of diversity, pursuing instead modes of study and practice that expand possibilities for social redistribution and transformation, the return to the toilers, the socially produced wealth that corporate capitalism has pilfered. We should be very suspicious of declines, narratives of decline, the notion that Black studies has fallen from some golden era. Black studies was always compromised. It was always compromised financially. It was always contested ideologically, externally and internally. It was always tenuous. It was always volatile. It was always fraught with uncertainty and contradiction. I think Black studies fails only if this conversation in which we're engaged now, no longer happens, and if that creative tension between a discipline, a movement, disappears. At the same time, those of us who still insist on education for liberation must confront, I believe, more urgently, the question of Black studies as an unfinished revolution. How might we reinvigorate the radical potential of Black studies? What does it mean today? What does it mean today to be relevant to 125th Street? What is the vocation of the Black studies scholar? Why are we writing? For whom are we writing? How do we attempt not simply to do community service or to engage in outreach, however noble those ambitions may be, but how do we struggle towards transformation, social transformation, political transformation? How do we strive toward a sense of collective mission? How do we revive an anti-imperialist ethos, an anti-capitalist ethos? How do we struggle within and beyond the campus? How is Black studies confronting the burgeoning crises of racial capitalism? How does Black studies engage climate disruption, which threatens the entire species, but which poses an especially profound threat to poor people and historically colonized people? What is the role of Black studies amid the global wave of political reaction that we're now experiencing? How is Black studies combating the shift from the welfare state to the security state and its prescriptions for war without end? How do we revitalize Black studies as a utopian project, an attempt to remake ourselves and to prefigure the new world that is waiting to be born? Thank you. Free Palestine.
So before I get started, I just want to say thank you to Zinga and Dr. Fraser and Sean and Sharon and everybody who worked on putting this conference together and for having me here. And we've been hearing all day about what a special place IRAAS is, and it is for me too. And so I think this is like the biggest honor, and I'm very excited to be here. I'm going to talk about the importance of considering sexual orientation as a category in African-American military history, which is a very old and developed subfield within African-American history. And this is part of my bigger research project, which is about African-American service members who went through different kinds of homosexuality investigations between World War II and 1993 when the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was established. And so in that project, I look at administrative homosexuality investigations, sodomy, prosecutions, and HIV criminalization, as well as challenges within the military and within the civilian world and civilian courts against these various things. And so I'm interested in looking at this history of the treatment of homosexuality and more broadly the treatment of differing sexual orientations in the military as being part of this sort of broad continuum that we talk about as the carceral state, in the sense of the military itself as having some carceral functions, having certain kinds of surveillance powers and restrictions on people and bodies and movements that are in some ways similar to, although not identical to, those of prisons, but there are a number of parallels and similarities. And I'm also interested in looking at military policing itself, which is a very specific kind of policing. It has its own body of criminal law. And so I'm interested in all of those things as they affect gay or lesbian or accused gay or lesbian or any other of the terminologies one might use for folks in those categories as they go through these different kinds of investigations. So I think we know a lot already in military history about the use of military service and veteran status as a way of claiming citizenship rights and making claims on the state. And I want to think a lot about how multiple and intersecting identities, including but not limited to sexual identities, shaped and in many cases limited veterans and service members' abilities to use the military to assert these rights. I think also we know a lot about how well and how much black soldiers and other service members have contributed to the military. So for example, like the early body of scholarship that is interested in refuting claims, racist claims that black soldiers weren't good soldiers, for example. We know a lot about how well black soldiers have performed in the face of segregation and also within military battles themselves. But this sort of is largely about combat troops, which really is not very representative, and it's almost exclusively about men. And so a lot of this is sort of interested in male soldiers' assertion of masculinity and manhood as they serve, which is very important and very true. But I want to think also about some of the things that this framework doesn't really explain. So for example, what do these martial notions of masculinity or manhood preclude, for example? And also what meanings might black women derive from military service? Women and men have many different experiences in the military. Importantly, women of any race are never conscripted, which of course is really important for men's military service. And also in the years of the all-volunteer force, the period after the draft, although all women of any race are vastly underrepresented in the military, black women are overrepresented relative to white women and relative to their population within the United States if you only look at military women. So this is a really important population in terms of how people are going about accessing citizenship rights and what their experiences are within the military. And so specifically, I'm interested in thinking about how both declarations of and allegations of homosexuality functioned in the American military and how that can expand our understanding of African Americans' relationship to the state and citizenship and surveillance. And so I'll give sort of one long example to talk about how I'm thinking about some of these things and why I believe this is important. So in 1947 at Camp Beale, California, the Army discharged approximately 13% of all black women who were serving in the Women's Army Corps at the time in a single homosexuality investigation. The Women's Army Corps was the section of the Army that women were put in if they weren't nurses. They had a separate corps, but there was a segregated, gender-segregated corps for women in this period in 1947, and then obviously the Army and the other services were also racially segregated. And so this is in 1947. It's a little bit after World War II. There weren't really that many black women in the Army at all in this period. There were roughly about like 380. Because there had been such a big drawdown after the war ended. And so about 50 women were all discharged at the same time. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how this happened. There were a number of World War II veterans who experienced this investigation, and some of them were also discharged in the process. And a number of the people who went through this investigation also went through a number of other investigations, both previously and then afterwards also. So there was a whole series of investigations here. Some of the World War II vets that I'm talking about were members of the only African-American Women's Army Corps unit to go overseas during the war, the so-called 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, which is pretty famous because it was the only black WAC unit to go overseas. And they were deployed to both England and France. Their main role was to sort mail so that it could be sent to the appropriate service members overseas. And 3 of them actually ended up dying abroad and are buried at Normandy. So they're a very important unit, and they weren't actually overseas that long because there had been a whole fight within the black press and black civil rights organizations to get black women deployed overseas because white women had already been deployed. And they ended up not really getting deployed until 1945, and the war ended 3 months after they got to Europe. And so then they're in Europe in this period where a lot of service members are in Europe basically waiting to be sent back, and there's thousands of people there waiting to basically get their turn to go home. And so one of the things that the Army did in this period was they created these sports tournaments so that people could basically have something to do. And so the 6AAA basketball team actually won the Eastern Theater of Operations basketball tournament while they were abroad in 1946. And this is like one of the most written about things about this unit, even to this day when members are dying and there's obituaries about them. Even if they weren't on the team, this mention of this basketball tournament championship is in like all the obituaries. And one thing that's interesting to me about this is that the star forward of the basketball team, who scored like almost all the points in the national championship game, was later expelled in one of these homosexuality investigations in 1950. So there were a series of investigations here, as I mentioned. There was actually a homosexuality investigation that started when people were deployed in France, and it was aborted because people were going to be coming home, and so they didn't actually go through the whole process of going through the investigation. After the war ends, people come home. A lot of people get out of the military, but some people, as I said before, are still in the military, although by 1947 it was only like 300 or 400 people for all black women in the Women's Army Corps. But because of the gender segregation and the racial segregation and the fact that the Army they would only station black women at about 4 installations in the United States in the immediate post-war period, a lot of these folks ended up serving together for a number of years and basically being sent among the same networks in the same limited number of places. And so that means that there, a lot of important relationships developed and friendships, but also animosities, that people basically were serving with some of the same people for years and years. And as in some of the statements, it sort of comes out that a lot of people really don't like each other and sometimes make claims about alleged homosexuality that happened like years previously. So when some of the members of the 6AAA who are still in the Army in 1947 end up together at Camp Beale along with some other people who weren't with them. And there's this massive homosexuality investigation of the whole unit, which happened a lot in the Women's Army Corps, especially in this period. It's a very important time for women in the Army. There's debates in society about whether women are going to continue being in the Army now that the war is over, and all kinds of concerns within and outside of the Women's Army Corps about suspected homosexuality and how it reflects on women in the military. So the actual investigations themselves involve interrogations of all kinds of people, suspects, informants. There's notarized statements that are taken from people that appear to be typed up by interrogators. In some of these places, not specifically the Camp Beale one, but there's sometimes transcripts of entire interrogations. In later years, there are sometimes polygraph tests and occasionally threats of sodomy prosecution. So these administrative homosexuality investigations can't themselves result in incarceration if it would result in discharge, but there's sometimes like a threat that there could be a criminal charge of a sodomy prosecution, which is more common for men than for women, but I have sometimes seen them for women. And so even though these are like theoretically administrative procedures, there's a lot of law enforcement technologies and strategies that are being used and threats that are being used to carry them out. And people are under a lot of pressure to make statements about other people, and you can see in some of the statements as you read them that people are, willing to do this to like varying degrees. Some people, give very elaborate, detailed statements about all kinds of people and everything they said they did, and other people give sort of vague, statements. So people aren't all participating, and some people, there's no record that they gave a statement at all. But some people are more interested in participating than others. And so in looking at these investigations, a lot of the black women in this Camp Beale investigation cite a lot of the same concerns that white women also cited about just like distaste for homosexuality, concerns about what this looks like for the Women's Army Corps. But the black women in this investigation also cite racially specific reasons, for example, how this would reflect on black military women specifically. As I said before, this is a crucial time for the establishment of women in the Army on a permanent basis. The Army hadn't even been ordered to desegregate racially yet. So this is really a critical time for black military women. And as I said, people are coerced into giving statements in many cases, but also sometimes people do things that are not coerced and really just gratuitous. Like one woman, for example, wrote to the NAACP to let the NAACP know that some women who were accused of homosexuality in this investigation might contact the NAACP and claim some kind of constitutional violation that the NAACP should not help them. Because as she wrote, it will only bring discredit and disgrace to us as an organization and as a race. The publicity will not be good, and it will make all that we have attained to become one of those I expected the Negro wax to end up just this way affairs. So there's a lot of concern about the representation and respectability of black military women and both military women and black people broadly in these sorts of claims that people like this woman make. And so this is the official military policy that the Army has, but it really relies on these service members to participate in enacting it. And this woman who wrote the complaint was actually right, because two women did appeal their discharges from this investigation. One wrote to the NAACP for help, and they did try to help, although they were also concerned about not getting negative publicity about it. But they were ultimately unsuccessful. And another woman appealed administratively within the Army, writing to the Inspector General. And she also didn't get the record changed that she wanted, but I did find some evidence that she probably later got into the Air Force, which had just been established and was recruiting women. So she may have had some military career later that's unclear how to really get the details, and her records are supposedly burned so you can't really find out. But both of these people who made these appeals cited their rights as citizens and made constitutional claims in their process of appealing as service members and as veterans, that these were things that they were entitled to treatment, to equal treatment on the basis of their citizenship as well as their military service. Then after this investigation concluded at Camp Beale, some of the same people who had made their way out of the investigation successfully were later investigated or sometimes were involved as informants, again at Fort Lee, Virginia in 1950. At the time, Fort Lee was the Women's Army Corps Training Center, so anyone who joined the Women's Army Corps would be sent there for training. And in 1950, when this investigation started, it hadn't quite desegregated yet. The Women's Army Corps racially desegregated in late 1950, and the investigation started in the earlier part of 1950. So at that time, there was actually a company of just black women that was about to be dispersed amongst the other companies of white women a few months later. But the investigation at the time it started was only this company of black women. And so a lot of the women went through this investigation in a very similar process, although it was sort of more intense by 1950, and there were some procedures that, these investigations sort of varied by location, even though there were certain procedures that people were supposed to follow. So this one was a little more intense, and the officers who were running it had everyone who was accused see a psychiatrist and get a psychiatric evaluation. But they were also willing to discount the psychiatric evaluation if it said that the person should be returned to duty, for example. So in this period when homosexuality is increasingly being solidified as a sort of psychiatric disorder, people saw it that way, but they also saw it as something else too, that it could be also communicable, that it was sort of, in a sense, a social disease, right? That it wasn't just a personal disorder, but people could also transmit it to others in a certain kind of way, that people might teach younger recruits to also be lesbians, and this would be a big problem for the Army. And so this procedure ended up, this is the one in 1950 that ends up kicking out the star forward from the basketball team. She and a number of other people are basically pressured into signing statements accepting general discharges, which is a category of discharge that's not as good as honorable, but not as bad as dishonorable. So the military sort of varied. There were these different sort of intermediate categories, but general was one of the intermediate ones. And so it wasn't as bad as a dishonorable discharge, but it was stigmatizing. People obviously wanted honorable discharges. Employers might be able to find out the character of the discharge. Also, the VA basically was like writing its own regulations about what kind of discharges it would provide benefits, including GI benefits for, and it was contested in Congress because it really wasn't following the law. So it was sort of unclear whether a general discharge would entitle someone to GI Bill benefits that they were supposed to be getting or not. And so this is a really negative event if someone is forced to sign one of these discharge papers. But because it's an administrative proceeding, and also the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which is the body of military criminal law, had also just been rewritten at this time and wasn't quite in effect. There weren't the same protections for defendants that there might be in a court-martial proceeding, and so increasingly after this period, commanding officers start doing these administrative discharge hearings rather than doing court-martials for a wide variety of offenses because it cuts down on their own procedural responsibilities and the responsibilities of defendants. And so the women in this investigation, including the star basketball player, are basically pressured into signing these general discharge statements. They don't have legal counsel. They don't have a right to legal counsel, at least in terms of having one appointed. And obviously, they're at a big disadvantage relative to the entire American military and all of the officers who are engaged in this process. So I've sort of given that description of these multiple continuous investigations to show how the military women involved in them made claims on the state as citizens and as military service members, and they could also be denied or had these rights and claims limited based on multiple identities, including their sexual identities or accusations of sexual identities, because it's really unclear what people actually identified as or what sort of sexual practices they actually engaged in. And so I want to look at these military interrogations, these investigations, the military justice system, as Marr was pointing to, psychiatry and the military healthcare system, as part of the development of the carceral state and the related practices of surveillance at the federal level on a very large scale. Because I think it can lead us to a deeper understanding of American citizenship and African American citizenship as it relates to military service. Thank you.
Thank you for those provocative papers. I hope that they certainly gave me a sense of the range of work that's being done in the field by scholars who spent some part of their formative intellectual years here at Columbia and are now out doing extensive and exciting work across the field. And the papers together, I think, are very interesting in that they almost divide into these two categories: those that explore, those who sit outside of the structures of power and offer a very vigorous challenge to dismantle them from outside, whether it be the sort of people deemed mad or the guerrilla intellectual like Walter Rodney, and those who exist within these structures, whether they be the halls of Congress or the military, who are nonetheless subjected to racism, sexism, homophobia, even as, and perhaps because they, of their insistence upon finding and creating a space within these institutions, and that their very existence within them threatens to transform them. We have been encouraged by, starting with Marr, to engage madness when it appears, to listen and attend to pronouncements, the pronouncements of those deemed mad, and to seek the kind of mad methodology that disrupts conventional ways of understanding. There are so many things in Dr. Fraser's presentation that stood out to me, but I'm going to figure out a way to tell someone to vanish, disappear. even as you refuse to do so yourself. Jordan and Chisholm, her reminding us of Jordan and Chisholm's legacy in terms of the ground they broke, but that the challenges that those who follow in their footsteps still face and confront. And to remember them when we talk about these advances, and reminding us of someone like a Barbara Lee, who's not only not chosen or is rejected because she's a woman and because she's older, but also because she's progressive. And then Professor Rickford, encouraging us to attend to the creative tension. These were really a phrase that stood out to me. The creative tension between Black studies as a field and as a movement, and his use of the phrase a generative dialectic, which I think has a lot to teach us. And then Natalie, taking us to a place that we don't often look, and that's the, especially, there is this kind of heroic tale that historians have had to tell about the role of Black people in the military to challenge sort of conventional understandings, but to have us look at it as an extension of our studies of the carceral state, especially around the treatment, the ways that people were under surveillance and then, dismissed or kicked out around issues of homosexuality, that it's just kind of takes a conventional subfield in African-American historiography and really sort of explodes it and gives us another way to think about it and look at it. So thank you for those papers, and let's open it up. We have a few minutes for a few questions, so hopefully there are some. There's one up here. There'll be a microphone coming up, so. Is it not on?
Thank you for that panel. My name is Amelia, and I'm a PhD student at College in anthropology. And I have two questions. The first question was for Dr. Fraser. I wanted to ask about, you sort of bring out different statements that are made about both Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan that sort of make claims almost about the incompatibility of citizenship and Black womanhood, even as these women are serving in some of the highest offices in the land. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, you brought up near the end Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and also Congresswoman Maxine Waters and some of the ways that we see this continue to resonate in our politics. And I'm wondering, in terms of kind of the scripts that people rely on to make that sort of same claim around the incompatibility of citizenship. And I mean, at least in Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's case, her Muslim womanhood in particular, but Black womanhood really as well. So I'm just wondering if you could speak about that. And then this other question sort of draws on multiple of the presentations, but it's directed towards Dr. Rickford. And I really enjoyed, you spoke about sort of the continued subversive potential within Black studies, even as it exists within the neoliberal university. And from many of the panelists, like Dr. Fraser spoke about sort of Black studies challenging kind of the boundaries of knowledge production and working across discipline. And in the first presentation, we heard a bit about resisting normativity. And I'm wondering, is there something about the resistance of discipline that is a key part of what you're speaking about in terms of the continued subversive potential within Black studies? Or could you speak a bit about disciplinary formation and the way that sort of Black studies resists disciplinarity in certain ways, and whether that is linked to the kind of potential that you're saying still exists within it?
So what I'll do is just talk about at least a part of the project really looks at the visual representation of Barbara Jordan, Shirley Chisholm, and looking also at contemporary discussions around Black women in elected office. And if you can Google the kind of caricatures that appear for Black women holding office. And so what I didn't talk about today is also the effort to kind of discredit and delegitimize Black women in Congress. Specifically, I'm thinking about cases that happen with Cynthia McKinney when she's in office. And there's all these kind of caricatures that also, there are these cartoons that talk about looking at these women as being non-patriotic. And so the very fact that there are Black women in Congress is seen as not being connected to patriotism. And I mean, that's something that continues to exist specifically for Black people, but in terms of Black women. And so what I didn't talk about today is also thinking about Chisholm's legislative policy and Jordan's legislative policy around immigration. I mean, Jordan is the reason why the Voting Rights Act included Mexican Americans. Right? So the vision of Jordan and Chisholm isn't just about looking at democracy as it appeals to African Americans, right? But looking at a kind of global and transnational experience. And so for Chisholm, her discussions around refugees, specifically Haitian refugees, and the policies by the American government to deny them asylum status while creating the opportunities for Cuban Americans just because they look phenotypically white, are all of these ways in which they reject who should be called a citizen and asserted their right to provide a kind of national discourse to address those issues.
Yeah, thank you for your question about. So yes, I imagine that we could probably have quite a provocative and useful conversation about how interdisciplinarity reflects or might reflect the sort of subversive character of Black studies, how transcending sort of disciplinary boundaries can sort of transgress these categories of worthy, knowledge more broadly. But I guess that's not entirely what I want to focus on, and that's not entirely what has been haunting me. So what has been haunting me, because Rodney is a hero of mine, and because I aspire to be a guerrilla intellectual, and I aspire to be a Rodneyan scholar, and God knows Rodney made a lot of mistakes. I mean, people like C.L.R. James were very clear about that, but nevertheless, is how do Black studies intellectuals challenge power? I mean, fundamentally challenge power. So not just speak truth to power, although I think that's important. You know, my mentor, Manning Marable, used to talk about that, right? I think speaking truth to power is important. But contribute to the toppling of power, right? To the overthrow of power, to the seizure of power by workers themselves, and by colonized people and by oppressed people. So what I'm talking about is how do guerrilla intellectuals contribute intellectually and materially to revolution? Right? And so that's the question that haunts me.
Other questions?
Hi, my name is Elisa Funderburk, and my question is for Lamar.
I'm really interested in your concept of madness, your 4 different types of madness, especially in terms of what it means to be a Black person in the United States today. Like Baldwin would say, just to be Black and somewhat conscious in America, I think means you have to be a little bit mad. And so I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on seeking mental health and the stigma around seeking mental health in the Black community, and how we can work to, I don't know, remove that stigma, and also remove the stigma of madness.
Yeah, I'm at once critical of the sort of psychiatric industrial complex and the ways in which it sort of pathologizes certain transgressive behaviors, and I sort of absolutely support, encourage, embrace, and am critically invested in psychiatry for some as a sort of route to liberation, or at the very least, relief, right? So I always already approach psychiatry with a critical ambivalence, right? A willingness to embrace, to take hold of its utility, and to rigorously, emphatically challenge, right, its the potential malice to which it's been put to work. And part of my project, what I didn't share with you today, and part of how I hope my project achieves in helping people to think critically about mental illness and their own sort of mental health. The afterword of my project is called The Nutty Professor, a confession. And I spend a great deal of time, at one point it was called The Nutty Professor, or Toward a Theory of Me, and I thought that was too precious. So The Nutty Professor, a confession, where I sort of speak about my own, how do I put this, vexed relationship to quote unquote sanity. So I'm in the tradition of self-revelation that might inspire, affirm, empower others to, again, talk about it, think critically about it, and decide what sort of path one should choose, whether that is, again, the couch of a psychiatrist, or which for many is absolutely useful, or alternative sort of spiritual and sort of psychosocial and critical and radical practices that might, again, bring liberation, revelation, maybe relief. So I have to have a complicated pivoting relationship to psychiatry. That's great.
Thank you all. Russell brought this up, but all of your works remind me of this whole notion of revolution. I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about, and white supremacy, in the sense that, you know, whether it be the military, whether it be politics, whether it be, you know, mental health and how you're supposed to behave, you know, guerrilla revolution, we're really talking about kind of reformulating and reimagining the state from the ways in which white supremacy and maleness and all of these kind of subject categories of behavior and the maintenance of power and the status quo are. And so I guess, you know, the question that I want each of you to, or a few of you maybe even expand upon more, is that, I mean, how it is that we can continue to be in society as intellectuals challenging the state and white supremacy, and trying to reimagine, you know, a new world for you know, people. I mean, I think that's kind of what we're kind of getting at, is that, you know, there's this tension and uncomfortableness with the way that the status quo is through our various institutions and all the categories that imbibe it. And so we're really talking about kind of overthrowing that, revolutionizing that, and putting in place another type of system. And I just kind of wanted each of you to maybe, you know, say more about how your work is attempting to do that.
Natalie, want to maybe start?
Well, I mean, I don't really have a fully fledged plan for revolutionizing the system, but there are maybe some limited legal recourse within the system. That's the best I can offer. So, I mean, one thing that's been proposed in Congress several times is that, unfortunately, this wouldn't benefit a lot of the people I've discussed because many of them are deceased, but that there could be a policy of reviewing and automatically upgrading discharges for people who were discharged for homosexuality. That's been proposed. It's never gotten out of committee. There theoretically could be some kind of financial payments for people who went through these sort of investigations or other sorts of unjust investigations within the military. There could be broader employment non-discrimination protections for LGBT people, which would help people make choices about whether they want to be in the military or not. Again, this doesn't actually help the people that are in my paper, but it could help future people. So I'll offer those things as possibilities.
In terms of, it's hard to think about, they attempt to revolt inside of the state, right? And there are limitations to what that looks like. But I think in terms of Chisholm and Jordan, specifically Chisholm, her discussion around seniority, and she would call it the senility system. Specifically, it was for old white men. And so thinking about, and because she goes in to the middle of the House floor and she demands to be taken off the Agriculture Committee because she says it's obvious that all they care about is that maybe a tree grows in Brooklyn, right? And so I think Chisholm, at least her framing, provides a way to think about, after rejecting her own committee assignment, there's more of a discussion on Capitol Hill about seniority. And the next year, when committee assignments go, it doesn't necessarily go totally in terms of seniority. So there are all these kind of minor ways that they're attempting to kind of reimagine and revolt against the state in which they are also existing in, which provides its limitation. But I also just think at the end, they're not career professionals. I mean, politicians. And so in times, they also grapple with the limitations of their political office and the way that it operates for them. And it may not be in total elected form, that that their ability to revolt also requires masses of people to stand behind the issues that they care about. And it's not solely in regards of the ones that are in leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm thinking along, I'm thinking along two tracks, I guess, in trying to respond to your question. I mean, on one hand, I think there's a very practical question of how Black Studies is operating within the academy. I mean, so I'm at Cornell, and at Cornell, of course, we have the very distinguished Africana program, but Africana, I don't think they'll mind me saying, is also struggling for enrollment, right? So it's asking this question of relevance, and relevance in a political sense, but also relevance in a very practical sense, in that teachers need students to teach, and so, part of the way, and of course many other disciplines, including my own of history, are struggling with enrollment, and part of the response has been, well, we have to basically promote ourselves, promote our relevance to STEM, or promote our relevance to business, or promote our relevance to, so the other day we were having a very engaging conversation about the nature and meaning of Black studies within Africana, and I sort of made a joke like, before long we'll be, trying to convince people of how relevant, Audre Lorde is to Wall Street, right? And so, but on the other hand, like, you do have to deal with this question of attracting students. If you don't have students in your classroom, then that process of transformation that so many people have talked about so eloquently today can't happen, right? And I think that more broadly, you can't adopt this attitude as, well, we do what we do, and they have to come to us. I mean, I think, you have to meet people where they are. So, I mean, that's one track. But sort of more broadly, when I think about your question, I think there's tremendous waves of alienation and disaffection within our society, and actually throughout the world, right? With deep alienation, disaffection with politics as usual, right? I mean, and some of the exciting young people, the sort of insurgent politicians that Zinga talked about, I think that they've been propelled right forward by that disaffection, and I think that part of our job as intellectuals, and those of us who consider ourselves radical intellectuals, is to understand very deeply that alienation and to appreciate it, and to attempt to harness it in a way that, somebody earlier talked about freedom dreams, right? In a way that really animates people's sense of a radically different future, right? That sort of utopian sensibility that, that remains subversive, and that unwillingness to be tamed, to be disciplined, to be chastened, to remain subjugated, right? And also at the same time, so to sort of reignite that imagination, but to connect it to people's material realities, right? And I think that's what gets back to meeting people where they are, right? Because if you don't have access to decent transportation or education or housing or clean water, right? Then obviously you're not going to be able to, your radical imagination is fettered. So we have to find a way to articulate that and to confront it.
Can I just say in 10 seconds?
10 seconds.
I'm interested in the sort of, many of the protagonists in my project are invested in, and model revolutions in paradigm. I'm interested in artists who don't want a seat at the table of Enlightenment reason, but want to flip the goddamn table and carry their meals outside, right? Cookout. Mm-hmm. And Enlightenment reason is one of several sort of prevailing categories that emerges during the Enlightenment that sort of structure our normative understanding of the world and function in the world. The human would be perhaps another, right? What does it mean to pursue the rejection altogether? No seat at the table, but flip the table.
That's a place to end. Thank you. So, this is wonderful, just listening to all of these thoughtful papers. Two things, we have a little break. Please join us at the next session at 5 o'clock, which is Mary Sabande, the artist whose exhibition is opening this evening, will be in conversation with our own marvelous Kelly Jones. And then that's over at Faculty House, and some of our people who are working here will direct you there. And then after that, there's the opening. After their conversation is the opening, and you've got to see this remarkable work, and it's only here until May 1st. So please come see that. And then I've just been given instructions, and I think I can still announce it. I've been given instructions by my boss, Sharon Harris, to invite you all, we welcome you we have an extended green room because we are about feeding people. So there's food and there's some coffee and some drink, and so just come over right across the hall and grab something to eat, what's left there, before heading up to the Morningside campus. Thank you again. Thank you this is a wonderful start. Thank you.